Now that we've moved on from World War I, we're going to take a look at the Harlem Renaissance. For a lot of you, this term probably sounds pretty familiar, but you might not be able to say specifically what it is. The Harlem Renaissance is important because it's the root of a lot of the culture, specifically African American culture, that was in the world today. Before I can really talk about the Harlem Renaissance, we really should be on the same page about such things as definitions. I think we've heard terms like Renaissance and stuff before, such as in Renaissance festivals and things, but it's hard to say exactly what it is. Renaissance means rebirth or renewal. In this case, the cultural Renaissance, referred to as the Harlem Renaissance, is saying like the rejuvenation of black culture. It's not saying it didn't exist before then, but this was just a chance for it to like grow again and come into mainstream America. It was the 1920s black cultural movement, and this was associated a lot with Harlem, New York, which was originally a white neighborhood, but during the 1920s became a lot of primarily African American, which we'll talk about in a bit, and that's where a lot of the society that African Americans established originated from. Just the background of this, we have the Great Migration that was associated with the end of the Civil War in 1865. Many African Americans began to leave the South in search of opportunity outside of the farms and plantations. The court case that was associated with this, that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, it was the one that decided separate but equal was okay in America, and it sent a lot of African Americans out into the region in search of something that was truly equal. Plessy versus Ferguson had legalized segregation, so African Americans wanted to find a place where they'd be treated the same as the South. The economy at this time was also suffering in the South because the bollweed was infecting a lot of the crops, making farming very difficult. And all these kind of led up to the Great Migration. It's the term used to describe the over 7 million African Americans who came to the North in the first couple of decades of the 1900s. And a lot of them came because of jobs in northern cities, and there's about 7 million altogether. Now, we talked about Harlem, New York really quick a couple slides ago, but this we're going to detail a little bit more. Like I said, it was originally a white neighborhood. With the end of the Civil War in 1865, many African Americans began to leave, and as we said, the Great Migration created more of them up there, but it became a white neighborhood, and then as the population began to shift in the 1920s, it was a lot of Africans were leaving because there were black real estate agents, and thus they began selling primarily to African Americans, which created the white flight, which is mass leaving of the area. And the Black Mecca is the term used to describe this because it was like the, not necessarily religious, although religion was big in the area, but like cultural center, like the grounds that a lot of African Americans had in common. There were a lot of African American groups that had headquarters in Harlem around the time of the Harlem Renaissance. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, was started by W.E. Du Bois in 1909, and their main priority was discussing the problems of African Americans, and the NAACP fought a lot for voting rights of African Americans and civil rights in general. Another thing that occurred around the same time was the Back to Africa movement with Marcus Garvey. The idea behind it was that people of African descent should be bound together by their common heritage, and then they should take pride in this. He promoted African Americans to move together in a single community, and wanted also people to move back to Africa, where their ancestors had come from. And the third major one that was in Harlem at this time was the NUL, or National Urban League, and it was started by Ruth Standish Baldwin and George Edmund Haynes. And among their mission was to help black migrants, workers, and coming to the north and southern states. They wanted to train black workers and social workers, and they had many programs in Harlem and throughout the north trying to help people find jobs and expand their education. A lot of the literature created in the Harlem Renaissance wanted to uplift the race, meaning that they wanted to represent black authors in literature in a way that would create a positive representation of African America, or to illustrate the problems that the African Americans were facing. And we'll talk about a little bit of the problems with these types of art later on, but there's a lot of modernist writing. There was a step away from a lot of the writing at the time that was based off completely logical things. Some of the literature is based off of jazz poetry, which is poetry set to rhythmic beat. And a huge person at this time was Langston Hughes, who wrote poetry, novels, playwrights, and columns. Jazz was a popular type of music that had its roots in the Harlem Renaissance. It was a shift in music, and it combined brass with piano, and Duke Ellington was one of the major musicians at this time. A lot of the music, as I said, was based off of this poetry conversion, and different types of music like blues, spirituals, and jazz were associated with that. Art was another thing that African Americans often used to uplift the race and portray in a positive light. But there's a wide variety of this type. There's Pan-Africanism, which was a style trying to unite people of African descent. You could see the influence of slavery and racism in a lot of the art, and then the depiction of everyday life. Aaron Douglas, and this is his picture on the right, painted abstract and in a way that showed people problems of African American people, what we're facing, but still try to inspire them. And you can see the star over in the middle of the area there, and that was common in a lot of his work to show that. The overall demographic, as I said, in Harlem at this time was African American, but Langston Hughes coined this term that Harlem was in vogue, and it meant that Harlem and the culture were really popular at the time, and it wasn't just for African Americans. It was a source of community for the black, but it was also entertainment for the white Americans, and the things like the speakeasies and cotton clubs are often problematic because there were times when they would only cater to white audiences, and a lot of people saw this as a problem because it was African American culture and it had become exciting for whites and still had segregation. And that's where a lot of the class and race problems came in. The overall demographic of Harlem was the upper middle class African Americans, and because of the white flight, it was obviously primarily all black neighborhood. The only time that integration really occurred was temporarily for entertainment. Like I said, the whites coming to the cotton clubs and stuff like that, but they were still in separate spheres because they didn't always go to the same places at the same time. Like the white people would go to the speakeasy, and then later on they would go, like the black African Americans would go in. Races still influence each other with a lot of the culture and music because things like jazz and stuff no longer were just limited to the African American population. Another form of controversy at this time was whether the art and literature were a poor depiction of the race, because some people used it as a way to uplift the race, as we talked about earlier, and show positive portrayals, but other people used it to show the problems and stuff that were going on, and a lot of people were worried that it was primarily for white entertainment and a way to exoticize African American culture, because it wasn't supposed to be made primarily for entertainment for white people, but a lot of it was what happened. And they had all this entertainment, but like I said, it was still segregated. Like, for example, the Cotton Club, Duke Ellington would play there, the audience, and then he'd leave and later in the day, and then go to all black place and play. And it wasn't really blended cultures as so much as exoticizing it, in some people's opinion. Overall, the context of this was in the 1920s. We had the Roaring Twenties, which was a break with tradition, new culture, new lifestyles and stuff, and this wasn't just limited to Harlem, this was throughout the whole United States, and I think it's important to look at the big picture at the time because it really makes an impact. Like, the outpouring of culture in the United States wasn't restricted to jazz and things. It was a whole new mentality shift throughout the United States. We also, the 1920s were the beginning of the lost generation because of the end of World War I. It was a lot of soldiers coming back, and with such a brutal world war, there was a hard acclimation to get used to American society too. So at the time, this lost generation coming in, they also had all this new culture forming, and it was really a big influence on the whole thing. And women at this time were getting more rights and becoming more part of society and shaping culture more than the rest had been in the earlier decades, and this all together brought this whole cultural movement of the Roaring Twenties, which included the Harlem Renaissance. When the 1920s came to a close, a lot of the white fascination with Harlem was dwindling, and they moved on because of the Great Depression and stuff, and it wasn't as new and exciting, so it wasn't so much as in vogue. The Great Depression began to occur, and it went on to the 1930s, and through the rest of the 20th century, there were a lot of race riots in cities throughout the United States as blacks and whites continued to clash over things like rights. And although Harlem's popularity went down after the 1920s, it had a lot of long-term influences in shaping black culture through literature, art, music, and much more, right up to the present day. And the cultural center is still there. And as we go on through this class, we'll see the effects of the Harlem Renaissance on things like the Great Depression and just through culture in general as up until present day. And then here are the sources for the pictures that you saw throughout the presentation.